Welcome to Brindlewick-by-the-Sea, a fog-swept town where every creak of the docks, every flicker of a lamplight hides a story waiting to be uncovered. Join Mara Finch, Eli Pemberton and Tommy Pike as they chase clues through windswept streets, forgotten lighthouses and hidden worlds that lie just beyond our own. This isn't just a mystery. It's the beginning of an adventure that will pull you in and refuse to let go. Book 1. The Vanishing Bookbinder. Chapter 1. Dust, cobwebs, and something peculiar. It was the sort of day that made people want to stay indoors, cold enough to shiver, grey enough to sulk, and just damp enough for the clouds to hang heavy like wet laundry across the sky. Brindlewick-on-the-Sea had many such days, and the locals wore them like old sweaters. A little frayed, but familiar. Perched on a weather-beaten stretch of coastline, the town was a huddle of crooked chimneys, cobblestone lanes, and buildings that looked as if they'd been put together in a hurry and never quite finished. On a clear day, you could see the sea from almost anywhere. Not the bright turquoise of postcards, but a restless steel-grey sheet that seemed to brood. Most people had long since stopped noticing the way it whispered against the shore, but Eli Pemberton always heard it. Eli had moved to Brindlewick less than a year ago, though moved wasn't the right word. Deposited was closer. His mother, an archaeologist with a habit of leaving without much warning, had gone missing on a dig overseas, and the official letter said there was nothing more the authorities could do. Which meant Eli was now under the care of Grandfather Pemberton, a man who wore 3 waistcoats at once and smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, machine oil and peppermint. Their house, number 11 Crow Lane, was an elderly Victorian that leaned ever so slightly toward the harbour, as though it wanted to hear the ships better. Inside, it was part workshop, part museum, part storage facility for half-finished ideas. Eli had planned to spend this particular day the only proper way, buried under a blanket, with a leaning tower of comic books on one side and a mug of hot cocoa on the other, basking in the warm, slightly too bright glow of the kitchen lamp. Unfortunately, his grandfather had other ideas. "Eli, be a good lad and fetch me the box of copper cogs from the attic," Grandfather Pemberton called from the dining room, peering over the top of his spectacles. His spectacles, like much of him, appeared to be perpetually on the verge of falling apart. His hair stuck out in all directions as if it had been startled, and his waistcoat pockets jingled faintly whenever he moved, for reasons Eli had never discovered. They should be next to the steam sorting machine. The one that doesn't work, mind you. This was a dangerous instruction. In the Pemberton household, machines that didn't work vastly outnumbered the ones that did, and the ones that did often did something entirely unintended. The attic stairs groaned under Eli's weight, not because he was heavy, but because the stairs liked to complain. They were the sort of stairs that might whisper to one another at night about the people who trod on them. A puff of dust greeted him at the top, swirling lazily in the slanted light from the single round window. The smell was a peculiar mix of mothballs, machine oil, and something faintly like burnt toast, which was unsettling given that the last toast made in the Pemberton house had been 3 days ago. The attic was not just messy, it was purposeful chaos, the kind that came from a lifetime of collecting and never quite finishing. There was a brass telescope missing its lenses, a grandfather clock whose pendulum swung backward, and something that looked suspiciously like a teapot wearing goggles. Grandfather's inventions stood in half-completed glory, some humming faintly as though they were dreaming. Against one wall, a wooden box with brass dials emitted a soft ticking sound. Near another, An umbrella hung from the ceiling by a string, spinning slowly as though stirred by a breeze no one else could feel. Eli picked his way through the maze of strange objects until he reached the steam sorting machine, which, as promised, was perfectly still and absolutely useless. The copper cogs were right where they should be, tucked into a crate marked "Do not remove or else" in Grandfather's blocky handwriting. Eli hefted the crate, prepared to make his escape, when something caught his eye. It was perched on top of a wooden trunk near the far corner, away from the neat piles of gears and blueprints. A book. Unlike everything else in the attic, it wasn't coated in years of dust. Its cover was deep midnight blue, so dark it seemed to swallow the light, and in silver letters that shifted faintly as he moved, it read, "Casebook of the Midnight Reader. Strictly private." Just below the title, stamped faintly into the leather, was a small silver emblem. 3 crows linked wing to wing, their beaks pointing outward like the spokes of a wheel. This was the kind of object you were absolutely not supposed to open if you were sensible and rule-abiding. Eli, of course, opened it immediately. The pages inside were filled with neat, looping handwriting, each entry beginning with case number, followed by a title, a date, and a short description. Some pages had tiny, intricate sketches in the margins, a magnifying glass, a broken key, a face half hidden in shadow. The words seemed strange somehow. Not strange in what they said, strange in how they looked. If he stared too long, the ink shimmered faintly like moonlight caught on moving water. Halfway through the book, he stopped. The page he had landed on was completely blank, except for 3 words, freshly written, in ink so wet it smudged when he touched it. Eli Pemberton. Next. The attic suddenly felt colder. A shadow moved across the far wall, though nothing had passed in front of the window. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, something ticked, slowly, deliberately, like a clock winding down. "Eli!" Grandfather's voice bellowed from below. "Those cogs won't fetch themselves." Eli shut the book far too quickly, tucked it under his arm, and hurried toward the stairs. But as he reached the doorway, a curious thought struck him, and refused to leave. It was the distinct feeling that somehow the attic hadn't let him leave alone. Chapter 2. The Ticking Thing. The morning after Eli found the casebook of the Midnight Reader, Brindlewick-on-the-Sea was no brighter. The fog clung low to the rooftops, and the harbour bells rang with a sound that carried more warning than welcome. Eli had slept badly. Every time he shut his eyes, he saw those 3 words written in the shimmering ink. Eli Pemberton, next. And then there was the other matter, the small brass sphere. He'd found it wedged between the trunk and the casebook, as if it had been waiting for him. At first glance it looked like one of Grandfather's abandoned gadgets, no bigger than an apple, with faint lines etched into its surface like the panels of a globe. But it ticked, not the brisk, efficient tick of a clock, but a slow, deliberate rhythm as if it were thinking. Eli had slipped it into his pocket and decided not to mention it to Grandfather just yet. Some things, he felt, were better kept to himself. School in Brindlewick was a squat red brick building that always smelled faintly of chalk dust and wet umbrellas. The playground was framed by the sea on one side and a row of leaning terrace houses on the other. It was here, on the low stone wall that separated the playground from the street, that Eli's 2 closest friends were waiting. Mara Finch was perched on the wall like a crow, lean, wiry, and watchful. Her long red hair was pulled into a braid that looked as though it had been tied in a hurry, and her boots were scuffed from climbing things most people sensibly avoided. Mara knew more about Brindlewick's forgotten corners than anyone Eli had met. She could tell you which rooftops you could jump between, which cellars were connected by old smugglers' tunnels, and exactly which shopkeepers might trade in information if you asked the right way. Beside her sat Tommy Pike, stocky and solid, with neatly cut black hair and a habit of taking things apart just to see how they worked. His satchel, a battered canvas thing covered in mismatched buttons, rattled faintly whenever he moved. Inside were a screwdriver set, a torch, 3 spare batteries, a coil of wire, and at least 1 snack. Tommy was rarely without tools or food. "You look like you swallowed a thundercloud," Mara said as Eli approached. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Eli said too quickly. He glanced around. The playground was noisy, but no one was listening. "Actually, maybe something. I found something yesterday, in the attic." "That's not news," Tommy said. "You always find something in that attic, like the time you found a toaster that sang 'God Save the Queen.'" "This is different," Eli said, lowering his voice. "It's a book, old, leather cover. Says Casebook of the Midnight Reader on the front, and—" He hesitated. "It had my name in it, written like I was next." Mara raised an eyebrow. "Next for what?" "I don't know," Eli admitted. "But there's more. This." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass sphere. It was warm in his hand, as though it had been sitting in sunlight, even though the day was cold. The ticking was still there, steady, deliberate. Tommy's eyes lit up. "Oh, that's brilliant. Let me see." He turned it over in his hands, tapping at one of the etched panels. "Not Grandfather Pemberton's work? Too fine. Look at this mechanism, and it's almost breathing." "That's not a thing," Mara said, leaning closer all the same. "Maybe it's connected to the book," Eli said. "One of the cases. There was a name in there, Elias Grange, and a title, The Vanishing Bookbinder. Ever heard of it?" Mara's brow furrowed. "I've heard of him. My mum told me about him once. He ran a shop near the harbour years ago, specialised in rare books. Then one day he just vanished. No one ever saw him again?" "That sounds like a case to me," Tommy said, already pulling a small magnifying glass from his satchel to inspect the sphere. "Maybe your book's a record of real mysteries." "Or maybe," Mara said with a grin that was half challenge, half invitation, "we should find out for ourselves." Eli wasn't sure if the cold that went through him was from the wind or the idea. But he knew one thing. The tick of the brass sphere was still in his pocket, and it was starting to sound a lot like a countdown. Chapter 3. Dust and Shadows. Eli hadn't planned on going anywhere after school. His plan was simple: get home, make a sandwich, and hide under a blanket until the strange brass sphere in his bag stopped doing whatever it was doing. Unfortunately, Mara Finch had other plans. "You're coming with us," she said the moment they stepped through the school gates. "I didn't agree to—" "Library," she cut in, walking backward just long enough to meet his eyes with a look that dared him to argue. "If your casebook's real, there'll be something about the bookbinder in the archives." Tommy Pike, crunching crisps behind them, spoke around the mouthful. "The restricted archives, obviously." The Brindlewick-on-the-Sea library stood on a hill just above the old market street, its grey stone facade streaked darker by decades of salt air. Brass letters over the entrance spelled out Public Library and Reading Rooms, established 1871. Though the public part was debatable, the place had more rules than a school headmaster's diary. Inside, the library smelled of paper, dust, and a faint tang of sea brine, as if the walls themselves had soaked up a century's worth of storms. The main hall was a cramped patchwork of mismatched shelves, each groaning under the weight of books bound in everything from worn cloth to cracked leather. Tall arched windows let in more shadow than sunlight, and somewhere beneath the floorboards came the low hum of the sea. A sound Eli imagined you could still hear, even if the whole town went silent. Mr. Fairchild, the librarian, was slumped behind the front desk, chin tucked against his chest, spectacles sliding down his nose. He looked like he'd been born in that chair and had simply forgotten to get up. "Don't wake him," Mara whispered. "I wasn't going to," Eli said, though the idea of having to explain themselves to Mr. Fairchild made his palms sweat. The archives door was tucked at the far end of the hall, a narrow green-painted door with a brass sign that read, "Archives, permission required." Tommy crouched by the lock before Eli could even suggest an alternative. "Pathetic security," he muttered, fishing a bent paperclip from his satchel. "You could open this with a biscuit tin key." The lock gave a reluctant click. Inside, the air was cooler, and the smell of dust was sharper. The shelves here were taller, the books older, their spines cracked, titles faded to whispers. A single green-shaded lamp glowed weakly on a central table, its pool of light swallowed quickly by the surrounding gloom. Eli set his bag on the table. The ticking from inside was louder now, deliberate, steady, almost expectant. He pulled the brass sphere out. Its etched panels caught the lamplight, and the needle at its center quivered faintly. Without quite knowing why, Eli began walking between the shelves, the sphere held in both hands. It wasn't pulling him exactly, more like it was guiding him, the way the smell of baking bread might draw you toward a kitchen. He stopped before a shelf wedged between maritime law of 1823 and the preservation of rare textiles. There, nearly swallowed by the dust, sat a small ledger bound in dark green leather. On its spine was a silver emblem, 3 crows, wing to wing, the same emblem from the attic casebook. Back at the table, Eli opened the ledger. The first pages were what you'd expect, neat lists of titles, borrowing dates, and names in a fine, spidery script. But halfway through, the handwriting changed. It became hurried, uneven, as though the writer had been looking over their shoulder. One entry stopped Eli cold. September 14th, 1963. E. Grange vanished this week, left behind the green-bound manuscript and the brass timekeeper. I have hidden them in separate places. May they never be found together again. Mara leaned over his shoulder, her voice barely above a breath. Elias Grange, the bookbinder. "So he's real," Eli said. His grip on the page tightened. Tommy reached toward the ledger. "And apparently so is this timekeeper, which means—" The brass sphere in Eli's hand gave a sharp, deliberate tick. The lamp sputtered. The shadows along the walls stretched, long and thin, their edges bleeding across the spines of the books until every shelf seemed to lean toward them. Somewhere beyond the lamplight came a sound. Slow, deliberate, like fingers trailing along the leather bindings. The 3 of them turned in unison. At the far end of the aisle a figure stood, tall, motionless. Its edges seemed wrong, not blurred by distance but by something else, like smoke or heat. The lamp flickered again. The figure was gone. So was the ledger. Chapter 4. The Bookbinder of Brindlewick. The 3 of them sat frozen at the green-lamped table, eyes still locked on the empty space where the ledger had been moments ago. The shadows between the shelves felt heavier now, as if the room itself were listening. That, Tommy swallowed hard, was definitely there just now, right? Eli nodded slowly. His hand still tingled from where the brass timekeeper had pulsed against his palm. Mara's sharp gaze swept the corners of the archive. If someone took it, they're either very fast or very good at not being seen. The silence pressed in on them, broken only by the slow, steady tick of the brass sphere. And then, "Everything all right, young Pemberton?" Eli nearly jumped out of his chair. Mara's elbow knocked the lamp, sending a wobbling ring of green light across the table. Tommy yelped outright. Mr. Fairchild, the librarian, stood at the end of the aisle. He was not, as Eli had assumed earlier, still asleep at the front desk. Up close, he looked less like a relic and more like the sort of man who had simply grown into his tweed jacket and decided to stay there. His spectacles sat low on his nose, and there was a faint scent of tea leaves about him. "You, startled us," Eli managed. "I should hope so," Mr. Fairchild said mildly. "You're in the restricted section without permission, though—" He adjusted his glasses, peering at the empty table. "If you'd asked, I'd have let you in anyway. Not much call for these shelves these days." Mara straightened, smoothing her braid as if she'd just been caught climbing through a window rather than picking a lock. "We were, researching." "Of course you were," Mr. Fairchild said, the corners of his mouth twitching. "What exactly?" Tommy opened his mouth. "A missing ledger that just— Ow!" Mara's boot landed squarely on his foot. Missing information," Tommy finished lamely, massaging his toes. Mr. Fairchild studied them for a moment, then nodded toward the far wall. "If it's history you're after, you might start with historical records of Brindlewick-on-the-Sea. Fourth shelf from the bottom, large brown spine, smells faintly of pipe smoke." They followed him down the aisle, the old floorboards creaking beneath their steps. Mr. Fairchild plucked a fat, leather-bound volume from the shelf and handed it to Eli with surprising care. "Everything worth knowing leaves a paper trail," he said, "though not everything in the papers is worth knowing." With that, he turned and strolled away, whistling softly to himself. Eli set the book down on the table and opened it. The spine gave a long, dry crackle. Between its pages was a folded sheet of paper, yellowed but perfectly preserved. Brindlewick Gazette, October 3rd, 1963. Local craftsman missing. Elias Grange, Master Bookbinder. Elias Grange, 47, known throughout the county for his unparalleled skill in the restoration and binding of rare volumes, was last seen in his Narrow Street workshop on the evening of September 14th. His disappearance coincides with multiple reports of strange lights in the shop's upper windows and the sound of a clock striking 13. Born in Brindlewick, Mr. Grange apprenticed under the London binder Horace Bellamy before returning home in 1942. His work was sought after by collectors across Europe. Locals describe him as meticulous and private, though some allege he was in possession of a rare and dangerous book in the days before his vanishing. Search efforts have uncovered no trace of Mr. Grange, though several items from his workshop remain missing, including a brass mechanical device of unknown purpose. "That's the same thing you've got," Tommy whispered, nodding at the brass sphere ticking quietly on the table. Eli stared at the article. If this is real, then the casebook isn't just a collection of strange stories. "It's a record," Mara finished, "and you're part of it now." Eli thought of the blank page in the casebook, the one with his name written in wet ink, Eli Pemberton. Next. His stomach turned. Why would my name be in there? Mara's voice was low. Maybe because whatever happened to Elias Grange isn't finished. They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the faint tick of the sphere and the distant sound of the tide dragging itself back from the shore. Finally, Mara leaned forward. "If someone just stole that ledger, they don't want us knowing more, which means there's something worth finding." Eli looked toward the darkened stacks of the restricted section, feeling the casebook's weight in his bag. The mystery wasn't something he'd asked for, but it seemed the mystery had asked for him. Chapter 5. Narrow Street. The three of them left the library in a thin drizzle that seemed to soak straight through to the bones. Brindlewick-on-the-Sea was at its most secretive in this weather, the narrow lanes slick with rain, shop signs swinging on tired hinges, the harbour shrouded in a grey mist that blurred the line between sea and sky. Mara walked ahead, her braid darkened to copper by the damp. "Narrow streets down by the docks," she said without turning. "Half the shops there have been boarded up for years, but Granger's workshop is still standing. Sort of." "Sort of?" Tommy asked, already rummaging through his crisps again. "You'll see." They passed the fishmonger's stall, where baskets of mackerel gleamed silver in the half-light. The smell of salt and smoke curled through the air. A gull cried somewhere overhead, sharp and impatient. Eli kept glancing down at the brass sphere in his bag. The ticking was slow, almost lazy, but every now and then it gave a faint mechanical click, like it was adjusting itself. He didn't know why, but he was certain it was leading them somewhere. Narrow Street was exactly what its name promised, a cramped ribbon of cobblestones hemmed in by leaning brick buildings. Most of the windows were blind with dust, their shutters hanging like broken wings. A faded sign for Grange and Son, bookbinding and restoration, clung stubbornly above a warped green door. The "and Son" had been painted over in a darker green, but time had worn the paint away so the letters showed through faintly, like a secret trying to be remembered. "Looks welcoming," Tommy muttered. Mara tested the handle. Locked, but loose in the frame. She crouched to peer through the keyhole. "It's dark inside, but not empty." Eli frowned. Not empty. She stood and brushed her hands on her coat. "Something's in there. I don't know what." The rain pattered harder, pooling in the uneven stones. Somewhere behind them, a footstep echoed. They turned, but the lane was empty, just mist and shadow. The brass sphere in Eli's bag gave a sharp single tick. Mara didn't hesitate. She slid a hairpin from her braid, crouched, and worked it into the lock with practiced flicks. Tommy raised an eyebrow. "Do I even want to know where you learned that?" "No," Mara said simply, and the lock gave a satisfying click. The door creaked open just enough for a sliver of darkness to spill out. The air that followed was colder than the street, and smelled faintly of paper, ink, and something sharper, like metal that had been heated and cooled too many times. They stepped inside. Granger's workshop was a long, narrow room with high shelves that seemed to press in from all sides. Stacks of books towered precariously, some bound in fine leather, others stitched together from scraps of mismatched pages. In the dim light filtering through the grimy windows, the gold lettering on their spines glimmered like buried treasure. On the far wall stood a massive workbench cluttered with tools, bone folders, spools of thread, ink pots, brushes and knives with handles worn smooth from use. A half-bound book lay open in the centre, its pages blank, except for a single word scrawled across the middle in hurried, jagged ink. "Leave." "Cheery," Tommy muttered. Eli moved closer, his eyes tracing the edges of the workbench. That was when he saw it, a deep scratch in the wood, starting at the book's spine and running off the edge of the table as though the book had been dragged violently away. The brass sphere in his bag began ticking faster. Mara was at one of the shelves, pulling down a small stack of ledgers. She flipped one open and frowned. "These aren't account books, they're instructions." "Instructions for what?" Eli asked. She turned the book so they could see. It was filled with intricate diagrams of mechanical parts, gears, rods, strange clockwork assemblies. Some of the sketches were almost identical to the brass sphere Eli carried. A floorboard creaked behind them. They froze. In the shadowed doorway at the back of the shop, something moved, tall, narrow, and impossibly still between one breath and the next. Its outline was human, but stretched in ways that didn't feel right. The ticking in Eli's bag stopped. The shadow began to advance, slow, deliberate steps that made no sound. Mara snapped the ledger shut. Time to go. They backed toward the front door, but with each step they took, the shadow seemed to lengthen across the floor toward them. "Don't run," Mara whispered. "It'll—" The thing lunged. Eli didn't think. He yanked the door open, the bell above jangling wildly, and they spilled onto the street in a tangle of limbs and breathless gasps. The cold night air slapped their faces, and for a moment they just ran. Past shuttered shop fronts, past the flickering street lamp, not daring to look back. Only when they reached the corner did Eli risk a glance over his shoulder. The doorway to Grange's workshop was empty, but in the dim glass of the nearest window he swore he saw 3 crows, wing to wing, watching him. Chapter 6. The Man in the Mist. The street outside was empty, or at least it looked that way at first. The fog had crept in thick from the harbour, curling around the lamp-posts and swallowing the far end of Narrow Street. The workshop's upper windows were black now, no sign of the faint golden glow they'd glimpsed a moment ago. "Where'd he go?" Tommy whispered, peering over Eli's shoulder. "Maybe he wasn't there to begin with," Mara said, though her voice was tight, like she didn't believe it herself. A cart rumbled somewhere distant, the clop of hooves, the rattle of wheels on cobblestone, and then the sound faded, leaving only the slow drip of water from the eaves. Eli kept scanning the mist. He couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow in the window had been looking at him. "Come on," Mara said finally, tugging them both back toward the main road. "Standing here like gawking pigeons isn't going to help." They ducked into the shelter of the old bus stop at the corner. Its glass panels were scratched with initials and cloudy from years of salt air, but it gave them a little privacy. Eli set his bag on the bench and pulled out the casebook. The brass sphere was ticking again, a slow pulse like a heartbeat. Mara glanced up and down the street, then leaned closer. "All right, what have we actually got?" Eli flipped the casebook open to the Vanishing Bookbinder. "We know Elias Grange was real, that he disappeared in 1963, and that this thing—" He tapped the sphere— belonged to him. Tommy unwrapped a toffee with unnecessary noise. "And we know someone doesn't want us finding out more. Whoever nicked that ledger at the library, they're in on it." Mara's eyes narrowed. "Which means the book, the sphere, and whatever Grange was working on, it's still dangerous, or valuable, or both." Eli hesitated, then reached into the casebook's back pages. There, folded between 2 entries, was the yellowed clipping they'd found earlier, the one with Grange's photograph. He spread it on the bench. Under the grainy black-and-white portrait, in neat serif type, were the words, "Elias Grange, Master Bookbinder, last of the Bellamy apprentices." "Bellamy?" Mara murmured, tapping the name. "That's London. My mum's always going on about the Bellamy Press. They printed the special editions for the Royal Archives. If Grange worked under them, he'd have known his way around. Very rare books." Eli glanced at her. "Rare like valuable?" "Rare like some aren't meant to be read." That sat between them for a moment, heavier than the fog outside. A sharp creak drew their eyes to the far end of the street. A man in a long coat was walking away from the bus stop, moving slow through the mist. His hat was pulled low, and his boots made almost no sound. "See that?" Tommy said. Eli had already seen. The man stopped, just for a heartbeat, and without turning his head raised one gloved hand in the faintest of gestures, not quite a wave. Then he slipped into a side alley and was gone. Mara broke the silence. "Tomorrow, first thing. We're going to Harbour Street." Eli frowned. "Why?" She grinned, that reckless spark in her eyes again. "Because that's where Mrs. Keats's old print shop is, and if anyone in Brindlewick remembers Elias Grange, it'll be her." Chapter 7. The Woman in the Window. The next morning, Brindlewick-on-the-Sea looked even more like it had been painted in shades of grey. The mist had not lifted overnight. Instead, it had settled into the streets like a stubborn tenant refusing to move on. Harbour Street was quieter than usual. The fishing boats were still tied up, their masts swaying like slow pendulums, and the few shopkeepers who had opened their doors did so with their collars turned up and their words kept short. Mrs. Keats's print shop sat halfway down the row, wedged between a cobbler's with a crooked sign and a tea-room whose windows were fogged from within. The shop front was narrow, its bay window lined with small brass typefaces and spools of ribbon in faded colours. Above the door, the painted letters had almost worn away, but you could just make out Keats and Sons, printers and bookbinders. Only there were no sons. There never had been. Mara knocked once, firmly. The sound seemed to vanish into the fog. A moment later the curtain in the window twitched, and a pair of sharp eyes peered out. "You're early," came a voice from inside, a voice like paper being folded. The door opened just enough to admit them, and they stepped into a space that smelled of old ink, hot tea, and the faint tang of salt from the sea. Mrs. Keats was small and wiry, her silver hair wound into a knot so tight it might have been keeping the rest of her together. She wore an apron smeared with ink and a long cardigan with frayed cuffs. "What's your business?" she asked, wasting no time. Mara, unfazed, said, "We're looking for information about Elias Grange." The name made Mrs. Keats's eyes narrow. She shut the door behind them with a decisive click. "You don't want to go poking after ghosts," she said, moving toward a kettle on the back counter. "Grange's story is like quicksand. You step in thinking it's just a bit of mud, and next thing you know, you're under." Eli glanced at Mara, then at Tommy, who had already found a jar of boiled sweets and was helping himself. "We think it might be connected to—" Mara cut in, stomping lightly on his foot. "An old bookbinding project we found," she said quickly, "one with his mark on it." Mrs. Keats turned, teacup in hand. "His mark, you say?" Eli nodded. "3 crows, wing to wing." At that, the room seemed to tighten. The hum of the kettle, the ticking of the brass sphere in Eli's bag, even the muffled sound of gulls outside, all of it seemed to recede. Mrs. Keats set down the cup. "That wasn't just his mark. That was the seal of the reader." "What's that?" Tommy asked, his voice muffled around a sweet. Mrs. Keats looked at each of them in turn, as though weighing something. "It's older than Grange, older than me, older than this shop. The reader was a sort of guild, not of writers, but of keepers. They guarded books that weren't meant for shelves, books that could change things, not in the new idea sort of way, but in the rearrange your world whether you like it or not sort of way." Eli felt his stomach knot. And Grange was one of them? Mrs. Keats hesitated, then gave the smallest of nods. "He was the last one I knew of. And the night he disappeared, I saw him from this very window, running toward Narrow Street with the seal in his hand." Mara leaned forward. "Do you know what happened to him?" Mrs. Keats's eyes drifted to the fog beyond the window. "No. But I know where he was headed before he vanished, and if you're fool enough to follow, you'll need more than curiosity." From under the counter, she pulled a small box and slid it across to Eli. It was no bigger than a matchbox, carved from some dark wood and bound with a thin strip of green ribbon. "What's in it?" Eli asked. "Not here," she said firmly. "When you're alone, and when you're sure no one's watching." As they stepped back into the street, the fog swallowed them again. Mara was already grinning, Tommy was shaking the box like it might rattle, and Eli was sure of two things. One, whatever was in that box was important. And two, someone, somewhere in Brindlewick had just seen Mrs. Keats hand it to him. Chapter 8. The Lighthouse at Low Tide. By mid-afternoon the sky had sunk into a dull, pewter grey. The air felt heavy, as though the whole town was holding its breath. Gulls wheeled in silence above the headland, their wings catching faint slivers of light that somehow never reached the streets. Mara led the way, her boots tapping against the uneven stones as they climbed out of the harbour quarter. Mrs. Keats said Narrow Street, she reminded them, and Narrow Street used to run all the way to the point, before the seawall collapsed. Eli adjusted the strap of his satchel. "And you think Grange went there?" "I think," Mara said, "that he wasn't running toward the sea for nothing." At the edge of town, the cobblestones gave way to a path of weather-bleached planks that creaked underfoot. Beyond it, slick black rocks stretched toward the skeletal silhouette of the lighthouse. At high tide, the causeway would vanish under churning water. Now the sea had retreated far enough to reveal a winding trail strewn with kelp and broken shells. Tommy eyed the stones warily. "You know what else likes slippery rocks? People who want to break their necks." "Then try not to," Mara said, already halfway across. The wind sharpened as they made their way over the causeway. Salt stung their faces, and the steady hush of the waves below felt louder out here, like the sea was whispering at their heels. The lighthouse loomed larger with each step, a white column streaked with rust, its windows black and unblinking. The door groaned open under Mara's push, releasing a breath of air that smelled of old rope, damp stone, and something faintly metallic. The spiral staircase inside clung to the wall, its iron railing cold and slick to the touch. They began to climb. It was the kind of staircase that seemed to go on forever. Step after step winding into shadow, the light from the doorway shrinking to nothing below them. Their footsteps echoed in the hollow space, mingling with the slow creak of the tower as it shifted against the wind. Halfway up, Tommy leaned against the wall, panting. "I'm starting to think Grange's big secret was a gym membership." "Come on," Mara said, though she was breathing harder too. "We're nearly there." Nearly was an exaggeration. Another dozen turns of the spiral brought them to a cramped landing with a single door. Beyond it lay the lantern room, a wide circular space where the great lamp sat in the centre, its glass panes dull with dust. The view beyond was nothing but the endless grey sheet of the sea. Eli turned slowly in place. "Doesn't exactly look like a clue factory." Mara moved along the curved wall, checking behind crates, prying at panels. "It has to be here," she said. "Keats wouldn't have sent us otherwise." Tommy was already slumped on a coil of rope. "Maybe she was just messing with us. Like, sure kids, go climb an entire tower for fun." Mara's shoulders sagged. Maybe I was wrong. For a moment all they could hear was the wind sliding past the glass. Then from Eli's satchel a faint tick, slow and deliberate. He froze. It wasn't the brass sphere this time. He dug into the side pocket and pulled out the matchbox Mrs. Keats had given him. The green ribbon was trembling, the box vibrating against his palm like a caged insect. Mara was suddenly alert. "Open it." Inside lay a tiny brass key, warm as if it had been sitting in sunlight. Eli scanned the room and spotted a narrow panel set low into the base of the lamp, nearly invisible under layers of grime. The key slid in perfectly. With a small click, the panel swung open to reveal a shallow compartment lined in faded green velvet. Inside rested a flat brass disc, its face covered in tight concentric rings and symbols that seemed to shift the longer you looked. Eli touched it, and the lamp roared to life. Light burst through the panes, slicing across the grey sea. As the beam swept the horizon, the water vanished, replaced by a vast forest of silver-leaved trees under a lavender sky. Bridges arched between colossal trunks, and something, not wind, moved through the branches. The beam turned again, and the forest was gone. Only the grey sea remained. Mara stared at the disc. "We're not just chasing a missing bookbinder, are we?" Eli didn't answer. He couldn't. Because deep inside his bag, the brass sphere had begun ticking in time with the disc, and neither of them had any idea what it would do next. Chapter 9. The Beam Between Worlds. The brass disc hummed faintly in Eli's hand, the same deep, bone-level vibration he'd felt when he first picked up the sphere in the attic. Only now the sphere was answering. From inside his satchel came a slow, deliberate tick. Then another, faster, and another, until the rhythm matched the strange, inaudible pulse of the disc. "Eli," Mara said sharply, "what's it doing?" I don't know." He set the disc into the velvet-lined compartment, but the humming only grew stronger, the symbols on its surface shifting like ripples in water. Tommy peered over his shoulder. "It's like they're talking to each other." The beam of the lighthouse shuddered and flared, flooding the lantern room with white gold light. The glass panes vibrated in their frames. Then, without warning, the light wasn't light anymore. It was a pull. Eli felt it first, a tightening in his chest, as if the air itself had hooked into him and was pulling. The space around him seemed to thin and stretch, the way water swells just before it breaks over your head. Then the lantern room unravelled in a blur of colour, skies the hue of crushed lavender, trees with leaves like beaten silver, and a river that gleamed as though forged from molten glass. A strange warmth bloomed in his chest, flooding his senses with a pull that felt both terrifying and beautiful, as if the world itself were inviting him in. In the distance, shadowed figures moved between the trunks, tall, unhurried, almost human. The smell of the sea was gone, replaced by something sharp and green, like crushed leaves and cold metal. For a breathless moment, they were there. Then the beam swept on, and the world snapped back into place, the grey sea, the dim lantern room, the slow roll of the waves below. Mara stumbled back against the railing. What was that?" Eli's hand shook as he closed the panel. "Somewhere else." "When else," Tommy muttered. His eyes were fixed on the sphere, still ticking in Eli's satchel. "And I think it wants to go back." Before any of them could say more, a faint clang echoed up from the base of the tower, the sound of the front door closing. Mara froze. "We didn't close it when we came in." Eli's pulse kicked. The stairs below creaked under deliberate, steady footsteps. Someone was coming up. Mara's eyes swept the lantern room. "No other exits," she muttered, then spotted the narrow maintenance window. "Except down." Tommy's jaw dropped. "Down. There?" She was already pulling a coil of rope from her pack. "You want to say hello to whoever's coming up?" The footsteps grew louder, steady and unhurried. Whoever it was, they knew exactly where to find them. Mara looped the rope around the lantern's central support beam and tossed the free end out the window. The wind caught it, making it slap against the tower's salt-crusted wall. "Go!" she ordered. Eli swung his satchel around, tightening the strap across his chest before clambering through the narrow frame. The stones were slick with spray, the rope rough against his palms. Below him, the rocks looked like a mouth full of jagged teeth. He made himself move, down, down, hand over hand, boots scraping for purchase. Tommy followed, muttering a prayer under his breath that turned into a string of complaints when his foot slipped. "I am not built for this." The wind whipped their hair into their eyes, salt stinging their cheeks. Seabirds wheeled below, startled by the sudden intrusion. From here, Eli could see the curve of the coast stretching away into fog, the black skeleton of the old sea wall jutting out like a broken arm. Mara came last, moving quickly and with the kind of precision that told Eli she'd done this before. She glanced up just in time to see a shadow lean out of the lantern-room window, watching them. Not moving to follow, just watching. They hit the rocks and ran, their boots slipping on kelp and pools of brine. The tide was beginning to creep back in, swallowing the causeway one wave at a time. They didn't stop running until the lighthouse was a pale tooth in the mist. Behind them, the beam swept slowly over the sea, then over the rocks. And for a second, Eli thought he saw that other world shimmer again in its light. Chapter 10. The Pull of Elsewhere. They didn't stop running until the lighthouse was no more than a pale streak against the distant headland. The tide was turning, waves slapping at the slick stones of the causeway. Mara led them to a tumble of black rock at the far end, the crumbled remains of the old sea wall, half swallowed by kelp and spray. The ruins formed a kind of hollow, sheltered from the wind, and they dropped into it one by one, lungs heaving. For a moment, none of them spoke. Only the crash of waves below and the slow hiss of retreating foam filled the air. Mara pushed damp hair out of her face and tried to grin. "Well, we made it." Eli leaned back against the cold stone, closing his eyes. His satchel was still pressed tight against his side, the weight of the brass sphere and disc a solid, almost comforting anchor. "Yeah," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We're fine." Tommy flopped onto the shingle, still catching his breath. "Speak for yourself. He paused, swallowing hard. Probably never climbing that many stairs again. Ever. The three of them almost laughed. Almost. For a little while, they let themselves believe it was over. The fog was lifting just enough for them to see the grey-green line of the sea stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere behind them, the lighthouse beam swept silently across the water, a watchful eye pretending not to notice. Eli set the satchel down and began to check the contents. The brass disc lay in its velvet bed, faintly cool to the touch now, its shifting symbols dormant. The sphere rested beside it, ticking softly like a watch in a quiet room. "Good," he murmured. "Everything's—" The ticking changed. Not faster exactly, but deeper, more deliberate, as though the sphere had just remembered something important. Eli frowned and held it up. Mara noticed the sound, too. "Is that normal?" Before he could answer, the disc gave a sharp metallic click inside its case. The etched symbols along its rim began to turn, aligning themselves one by one until they formed a ring that pulsed with a faint golden light. Tommy sat up. "It's doing that thing again." Eli tried to separate them, to pull the sphere away from the disc, but the two locked together as if drawn by invisible threads. The hum started low, then climbed, resonating in the pit of his stomach. The ruined walls around them seemed to lean inward. Light began to seep from the seam between sphere and disc, spilling onto the wet stones, curling into the air like smoke underwater. Mara took a step back. "Eli!" The light swelled, bending the air until it shimmered. Through the haze they saw it, the lavender sky, the silver-leafed trees, the molten glass river. But now the wind from that place touched their faces, cool, fragrant, carrying the smell of crushed leaves and something sharp, like rain on metal. "It's beautiful," Tommy whispered, moving closer. "Don't," Mara said sharply. "Not until we know—" But Tommy's gaze was fixed beyond the veil. In the shifting light, a figure emerged between the trees, tall, still, watching. The hum rose higher, and the pull began. Subtle at first, then strong enough to make Eli's balance tilt. He grabbed Tommy's arm. "Tommy, back up!" The figure in the other world reached forward. For a heartbeat, Eli thought the shimmer might collapse, that they might all tumble backward into the cold safety of the seawall ruins. Instead, Tommy's hand slipped through his. The light flared, and Tommy vanished, swallowed by the golden glow without a sound. The veil snapped shut, leaving nothing but wet stone and the echo of the hum in Eli's bones. Mara's face was pale, her breath coming fast. "Where is he?" Eli stared at the space where Tommy had been, the sphere still warm in his hands. "Not here," he said, the words heavy and certain. The tide was climbing fast, licking at the edge of the causeway as the 3 crows above the lighthouse melted into shadow. Eli stood with the casebook pressed tight under his arm, feeling the cold from its cover seep into his skin. Mara kept her gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "We'll find him," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands wouldn't stop flexing at her sides. Eli didn't answer. The image of Tommy being pulled into that light, swallowed whole by a place that wasn't theirs, burned in his mind. He opened the casebook. The pages riffled as though caught in a breeze only it could feel, stopping on a new entry, the ink so fresh it gleamed. Case number 46. Elias Grange, the Bookbinder. Status: reopened. Below, a second line appeared as he watched, each letter forming with deliberate care. To find him is to unbind the truth of Brindlewick. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of charred paper and something metallic. Mara turned, brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" Eli shut the book. "It means finding Tommy, means finding Elias Grange." "And," Mara pressed. Eli's eyes tracked the distant glow of the lighthouse beam, slicing the dark like a warning. "And that means pulling at the threads that hold Brindlewick together." The sea surged, black water closing over the causeway, and somewhere deep in town, a bell began to ring. And that's where we must close the book, for now. The case of Brindlewick-by-the-Sea is far from solved, and if we've learned anything, it's that secrets here have a habit of washing back ashore. If you've enjoyed sleuthing with us, tap that subscribe button and ring the bell so you'll be ready when the next mystery comes calling. We'll be back with more fog, more clues, and, if we're lucky, a few answers. Until then, keep your lantern lit, and remember, in Brindlewick, the truth is never far, but it's never in plain sight either.